if most decisions you regret began with a beautiful sounding thought? Critical thinking is not about being skeptical for its own sake. It's a precise craft that separates persuasive noise from reliable signal. In this audiobook, you will learn a repeatable toolkit, how to dismantle sloppy arguments, spot hidden assumptions, map causal reasoning, and design questions that force clarity. Listen to the whole recording. Every chapter builds a practical skill you can use immediately. Skip one and you risk missing the single tweak that turns ordinary judgment into predictable, high-quality decisions. Chapter 1. What critical thinking is and why it matters. Critical thinking is often invoked as a virtue, an abstract skill that makes people smarter. But to be useful, critical thinking must be operational, a set of repeatable moves you apply when information is noisy, stakes are real, and intuition is fallible. At its core, critical thinking is the disciplined practice of transforming ambiguous inputs into reasoned, evidence-grounded judgments. It rests on three pillars: clarity, defining terms and premises precisely; structure, turning fuzzy reasoning into transparent argument maps; and calibration, measuring confidence against evidence. The first practical step is clarity. Many disagreements collapse once terms are defined. What do we mean by success, risk, or freedom in this context? Instead of assuming shared meaning, state definitions at the outset. Use short, explicit operational definitions. By success, I mean a sustained 12-month, 20% revenue growth. So the argument becomes testable rather than sentimental. The next move is structuralization. Any claim worth evaluating can be decomposed into premises and conclusions. Write the claim as a single sentence, then ask, what assumptions must hold for this claim to be true? List premises explicitly, factual claims, causal links, or probability assessments. When you see a policy proposal, for instance, turn it into a mini logic tree. If A, then B; if B, then C, therefore C follows from A. Visual maps are powerful because they externalize hidden leaps. A common error is to accept the conclusion while ignoring a weak or unproven premise. The third pillar, calibration, addresses confidence. Good thinkers don't simply assert, "I'm sure." They state why and quantify uncertainty when possible. Use probability phrases carefully. Attach numeric ranges when feasible. I estimate 60 to 70% likelihood. And explain the evidence basis. Calibration prevents overcommitment and encourages continuous updating as new data arrives. Critical thinking also requires procedural habits. Always ask the four basic diagnostic questions. What exactly is being claimed? What reasons support this claim? What evidence would count against it? What alternative explanations exist? These questions convert passive consumption into active interrogation. Next, learn to separate description from prescription. Much of everyday debate mixes facts with values. People often assume an ought leap. When someone argues, X is happening, therefore we must do Y, pause. Which normative premise links the fact to the action? Make that premise explicit and examine it. Some value premises are reasonable, others mask ideological assumptions. Another essential habit is error auditing. After you reach a tentative judgment, run a brief reverse test. What plausible evidence would make you change your mind? This devil's advocate step isn't sophistry, it's a sanity check that identifies fragile inferences and improves resilience. Chapter 2. Cognitive biases, the predictable ways minds mislead us and how to counter them. Human minds are efficient pattern engines optimized for survival, not for formal logic. Because of that design, cognition uses heuristics, fast mental shortcuts that produce systematic biases. A critical thinker doesn't deny biases, she anticipates them and applies countermeasures. The important biases to master are not exotic. They are the ones that silently shape most decisions: confirmation bias, availability bias, anchoring, framing effects, and motivated reasoning. Confirmation bias is the tendency to seek and overweight evidence that confirms our prior beliefs. To counter it, deliberately seek disconfirming evidence. Create a rule. For every source that supports your position, find one reputable source that contradicts it and treat both with equal scrutiny. Evaluate why the disconfirming evidence might be weak or stronger than your preferred claim. Availability bias skews probability judgments toward vivid or recent events. People overestimate the likelihood of dramatic but rare occurrences, plane crashes, dramatic frauds, because they are prominent in memory. Counter this by consulting base rates, objective frequency data, rather than relying on salience. Anchoring occurs when an initial number or frame unduly influences subsequent estimates. If you're negotiating or forecasting, always produce your independent estimate before seeing any anchors. If an anchor is presented, subtract explicitly and justify the adjustment numerically. Framing effects change choices depending on how options are presented. Loss versus gain. Framing is the classic example. Recognize when framing is at work by rephrasing the same facts in alternative frames and checking whether your preference flips. If it does, interrogate whether the frame is socially useful or manipulative. Chapter 3. Argument Structure and Logical Fallacies. Building and breaking chains of reason. Good thinking speaks the language of arguments. Bad thinking confuses correlation with causation, conflates anecdotes with data, and substitutes rhetoric for proof. At the practical level, every argument can be represented as a set of claims supported by reasons and evidence. The first skill is argument reconstruction. When someone asserts X, rewrite the argument in numbered premises and a conclusion. This exercise forces clarity and identifies missing steps. Once reconstructed, run a fallacy audit. Common fallacies include ad hominem, attacking the person instead of the claim, straw man, misrepresenting the opponent's position, false dichotomy, presenting two extremes as the only options, slippery slope, assuming extreme outcomes without mechanism, and post hoc ergo propter hoc, confusing temporal sequence with causation. For each fallacy, learn the specific diagnostic. Ad hominem is present when the rebuttal focuses on the speaker's character rather than the evidence. Straw man appears when a simplified version of the opponent's claim is refuted rather than the real claim. Understanding fallacies is not merely academic. It equips you to salvage useful pieces from messy rhetoric. If an argument contains some fallacious moves but also has valid supporting facts, extract the valid premises and reevaluate the conclusion. Another critical structure is causal reasoning. Chapter 4. Evidence and sources, how to judge, what to trust, and when to update. Your beliefs, evidence quality, is the axis on which rational judgments pivot. The same claim can be supported by anecdote, survey, experiment, or longitudinal study, and these forms differ dramatically in reliability. A basic heuristic ranks evidence by methodological robustness. Randomized controlled trials, where feasible, near the top, well-executed quasi-experiments and longitudinal studies next, cross-sectional observational studies lower, and anecdotes or appeals to authority near the bottom unless corroborated. But method alone matters only when executed well. Always evaluate study design, sample size, small n studies are noisy, sampling method, convenient samples bias results, measurement validity, does the variable actually measure what it purports to, and analytical transparency, are the methods and code available. For claims drawn from complex data, demand replication and robustness checks. Do alternative analyses produce similar results? A recurring practical error is the misuse of statistics, correlation treated as causation, p-hacking, selective analysis that inflates significance, and publication bias, null results rarely published. Learn basic statistical literacy. Understand effect sizes, not just p-values. A statistically significant tiny effect may be practically irrelevant. Check confidence intervals and report heterogeneity. Not everyone is affected equally. For sources, prefer primary research over secondary summaries when stakes are high. Secondary sources, news articles, op-eds, or summaries are useful for orientation but often compress nuance. Chapter 5. Thinking with probabilities. Living with uncertainty. Probabilistic thinking is the most useful tool a critical mind can adopt because the world rarely hands us certainties, it hands us risks and degrees of confidence. Thinking in probabilities means replacing binary verdicts, true, false, right, wrong, with graded judgments. This claim is 70% likely, given current evidence, that policy carries a 30% chance of failure within 5 years. Start by practicing simple numeric calibration. When you say likely, attach a number between 55 and 80%. When you say very likely, use 80 to 95%. When you say possible, use 10 to 40%. Numeric labels force precision and make updating possible. The next habit is to articulate priors, your initial sense of plausibility, before new data arrives. Priors anchor thinking. They must be explicit because they determine how much new evidence shifts your belief. For instance, if a stranger claims an extraordinary miracle, your prior should be very low. It would require extraordinarily strong evidence to move you. Use Bayes' rule informally. Assess how diagnostic the evidence is. Does it occur much more often if the claim is true than if it is false? And adjust your belief accordingly. Crucially, report uncertainty ranges and the key variables that would alter your estimate. This transforms debate from assertion to transparent probability management. I estimate 60% confidence in policy X succeeding, conditional on funding remaining stable and no major regulatory changes. Third, embrace decision rules under uncertainty. Many choices must be made without full resolution. Use expected value thinking where practical. Multiply the benefit by its probability and compare across options. When probabilities are hard to quantify, use a qualitative expected value lens. Ask which option has the best fatal flaw avoidance and which preserves optionality. Chapter 6. Bayesian updating. How to change your mind correctly. Bayesian updating is the disciplined method for changing beliefs when new evidence arrives. It's how smart people avoid stubbornness without becoming gullible. The core idea is simple. Start with a prior belief, observe data, assess how likely that data would be if your belief were true versus if it were false, and then update to a posterior belief that reflects both prior and evidence. Operationalize this with a 3-step ritual. First, record the prior numerically or verbally with a confidence band. Prior 30 to 40% chance that project A meets target. Second, When new evidence appears, ask, how probable is this evidence under the hypothesis versus the null? Be specific. A 15% month-over-month sales increase is 10 times more likely under hypothesis H than under baseline B. Third, perform the update. Increase or decrease confidence proportional to that likelihood ratio and document the new posterior and why you updated. Chapter 7. Mental models and frameworks, tools that scale your thinking. Mental models are conceptual lenses, simple, portable abstractions that help you see patterns and predict outcomes across domains. The value of a mental model is not novelty, but applicability. A handful of robust models used habitually outruns a large collection of shallow facts. Start by learning a small toolkit: supply and demand, opportunity cost, marginal utility, selection bias, feedback loops, incentive design, and second-order consequences. For each model, practice translating real-world situations into the model language. For instance, when evaluating a new regulation, ask, what incentives change for each stakeholder? Who gains and who loses, and what are likely strategic responses? Mental models interlock. Use multiple to triangulate. A promising startup might look attractive under demand analysis, but fail under incentive misalignment or negative feedback loops in scaling. Use checklists. For decisions about people, ask selection effects and incentives. For systems, ask about feedback, delays, and nonlinearity. Avoid model overreach. No model explains everything. Treat models as tools to generate hypotheses and question framing, not as oracles. Chapter 8. Counterfactual and causal. Thinking what would have happened and why it didn't. Counterfactual thinking, asking what if about alternate histories, is central to causal understanding because causation is inherently comparative. Event A caused outcome B if B would likely not have happened without A. Practice counterfactuals deliberately. For any key claim, construct the nearest plausible counterfactual. If policy X had not been implemented, what would likely have occurred? The quality of a counterfactual depends on plausibility and specificity. Vague, maybe things would be different. Claims are useless. Use counterfactuals to identify causal mechanisms. If removing A clearly changes B in simulation or historical analogues, A is likely causal. Distinguish mechanism from correlation. An observed correlation between ice cream sales and drownings is not causal. The seasonal variable, temperature, is a confounder. To test causal claims, look for natural experiments or instrumental variables, situations where exposure to the purported cause is quasi-random, giving cleaner comparisons. When experiments are infeasible, use process tracing. Assemble multiple independent lines of evidence that converge on the mechanism. Also be wary of hindsight bias, the tendency to see past events as more predictable after the fact. Chapter 9. Analogical reasoning. When comparisons help and when they mislead. Analogies are cognitive shortcuts that transfer structure from a familiar domain to a new one. They are powerful for inventing solutions but dangerous when surface similarities hide crucial structural differences. The first rule of analogical reasoning is to map relational structure, not superficial features. When you say X is like Y, specify which relationships correspond. Are you mapping feedback mechanisms, incentive structures, or scaling challenges? For example, comparing managing a company to captaining a ship is useful only if you clarify which ship metaphors apply. Navigation under uncertainty, crew coordination, or maintenance of systems. Second, inspect the mismatch space. List where the analogy breaks down, and whether those mismatches are critical to the problem at hand. Many bad analogies fail precisely because they ignore timescales, agent heterogeneity, or institutional constraints that change outcomes. Third, use multiple analogies to triangulate. If 3 distinct analogies point to the same intervention, your confidence rises. If they diverge, probe the differences. Analogies are especially useful in early-stage problem framing and creative ideation. Use them to generate hypotheses, but move quickly to empirical tests that ground any proposed transfer. Chapter 10. Decision. Architectures. Designing choices that produce better outcomes. Decision architecture is about shaping how choices are presented and structured so that better decisions are the path of least resistance. Start by recognizing default effects. People often accept pre-selected options. Use defaults to encourage prudent behavior, opt-out organ donation, automated savings, or default low-risk investment allocations while preserving autonomy. Next, simplify complex choices by reducing options and clarifying trade-offs. Too many alternatives cause paralysis and regret. Present information with clear, comparable metrics, such as annualized fees or expected returns, rather than opaque jargon. Another principle is to force commitment devices for high-cost temptations, cooling off periods for major purchases, staged enrollment for behaviors that require habit formation, and automatic escalation rules that limit impulsive reversals. Leverage framing deliberately to highlight long-term costs and avoid short-term bias. Show cumulative cost pictures and opportunity cost comparisons. Decision aids, such as checklists, decision trees, and pre-mortem analyses, reduce errors by externalizing process steps and making implicit assumptions explicit. The pre-mortem is particularly powerful. Imagine a decision failed spectacularly and work backward to list plausible failure modes, then design mitigation up front. Chapter 11. The ethics of argument, persuasion, responsibility, and intellectual honesty. Critical thinking is not value neutral, it carries ethical obligations because arguments shape actions that affect others. Intellectual honesty requires accurate representation of evidence, acknowledgement of uncertainty, and a willingness to correct errors publicly. Start by practicing transparent sourcing, cite key evidence, and disclose potential conflicts of interest. When persuading, distinguish between persuading for consent, providing arguments and evidence, and persuading through manipulation, withholding facts, exploiting emotional triggers, or misrepresenting probabilities. Avoid rhetorical tricks that substitute style for substance. They may win short-term compliance but degrade trust. Another moral duty is to respect interlocutors' agency, present choices with clear consequences, and allow time for deliberation rather than pressuring rapid assent. In public communication, avoid rhetorical fear-mongering. Use caution when public emotions are high because misinformation spreads quickly and causes harm. Commit to corrective action when you discover you were wrong. Retract, update, and explain the change in reasoning. For institutions, codify norms of debate that reward evidence and civility rather than rhetorical dominance. Require citation standards, peer review, and transparent methods. Finally, cultivate intellectual humility as an ethical stance. Acknowledge the limits of your knowledge, invite dissenting views, and treat disagreement as an opportunity to refine understanding rather than as a personal affront. Ethics in argumentation protects both truth and humane discourse, making critical thinking a public good rather than a private ace. Chapter 12. Scientific thinking in everyday life. Experiments, controls, and practical tests. Scientific thinking reduces uncertainty by designing tests that isolate variables and measure effects. You can apply the same logic to everyday problems. Start by turning questions into hypotheses and then design simple, low-cost experiments that test the hypothesis with controls. For example, to test whether a new productivity app helps you write more, run a 2-week A/B test. Week A, use the app. Week B, don't. And compare word counts while keeping other conditions constant. Use randomization where possible to avoid selection bias and ensure comparability. Measure outcomes with clear, relevant metrics and run the test long enough for signal to emerge, but short enough to be practical. Always include a control, a baseline behavior, so you know whether observed changes are due to the intervention or to noise. Use replication. Repeat the test or have peers run parallel trials to check robustness. Beware common experimental errors. Small sample sizes, multiple unreported comparisons, and lack of pre-registered protocols that permit fishing for significance. When you encounter published studies, look for replication attempts and meta-analyses. A single study is rarely definitive. Apply the same rigor to personal decisions. Track data, test short interventions, and be willing to abandon practices that fail replication. Scientific thinking democratizes inquiry. It converts guesswork into an iterative learning process and prevents belief entrenchment by privileging evidence over anecdote. Chapter 13. Statistical literacy. Reading numbers. Without being fooled. Numbers confer authority. Statistical literacy prevents misuse and misinterpretation. Start by distinguishing absolute and relative differences. A 50% increase sounds large but may be small in absolute terms. From 2 to 3 is plus 50% but small absolute change. Check denominators. Percentages derived from tiny bases are unreliable. Understand variability and margin of error. Survey results quoted without confidence. Intervals are incomplete. A 3% margin of error matters greatly in tight comparisons. Learn to read graphs critically. Check axes for truncation or disproportionate scaling that exaggerates trends and verify whether smoothing hides volatility. Beware of p-hacking, selective reporting of statistically significant results, and publication bias where null results go unpublished. For causality claims from observational data, look for control variables, sensitivity analyses, and robustness checks. Absence of such tests weakens causal inference. Use simple statistical sanity checks. Does the effect size match the proposed mechanism? Does the timing of effects align logically? When in doubt, seek meta-analyses or consult subject matter experts who can assess methodological quality. Finally, practice with real data sets. Download public data, run simple descriptive analyses, and compare headlines with raw numbers. Statistical literacy converts impressive-sounding claims into testable facts and keeps you from being impressed by numbers that lack rigor. Chapter 14. Rhetoric and narrative. How stories shape. Belief and how to stay grounded. Stories are persuasive because humans are narrative animals. They make data memorable, but can also distort reality by overemphasizing single cases. Learn to separate the rhetorical power of a story from its evidentiary weight. When a compelling anecdote is used to support a broad claim, ask for base rate evidence. How common is this outcome across relevant populations? Use stories as hypothesis generators, not proofs. Also analyze narrative structure. Who is the protagonist, what moral is implied, and whose interests are served by the framing. Recognize that emotionally charged narratives often bypass analytical scrutiny. Introduce cooling time and data checks before accepting narrative-driven claims. When you craft your own persuasive messages, use stories responsibly. Pair anecdotes with aggregate data and clear caveats. Teach audiences the difference. Tell the story, then show the statistics, then explain what the story does and does not imply. Finally, maintain narrative pluralism. Seek multiple stories from diverse perspectives so you avoid single-story dominance that silences important counterexamples. Stories can humanize evidence without replacing it. Used well, they make thoughtful conclusions stick, not sloppy ones. Chapter 15. Applying critical thinking. Practical routines for daily. Use practical critical thinking is habitual. Create daily routines that make rigorous habits automatic. Begin each day with a 5-minute claim audit. Scan headlines or inbox items. Pick the most consequential claim and rapidly map its premises and missing evidence. Use a simple decision checklist for major choices. Define objectives, list options, identify key uncertainties, outline a small test, and set a decision review date. Keep an evidence notebook where you record notable claims, the source, your prior confidence, and any updates. This builds an empirical track record of what sources were reliable. In conversations, apply the question quartet. What exactly is claimed? Why should I believe it? What would disconfirm it? What are the alternatives? Use these questions to convert debate into constructive inquiry rather than opinion exchange. For information diets, diversify sources across ideological and methodological lines and favor primary sources on big issues. Finally, cultivate intellectual accountability. Share your reasoning publicly in short posts or conversations and invite critique. Social exposure accelerates error correction. Over time, these small rituals, daily audits, checklists, evidence logs, and public accountability compound into a practical, disciplined mind that makes fewer mistakes and adapts faster when reality shifts. Chapter 16. Teaching critical thinking, curricula, exercises, and assessment. Teaching critical thinking requires more than lecturing about fallacies. It demands concrete curricula, deliberate practice, and assessment models that measure process as well as product. A robust curriculum blends conceptual instruction with frequent graded practice. Short exercises that train specific sub-skills, argument E. Reconstruction, probabilistic estimation, evidence evaluation, followed by integrated projects that require students to apply multiple skills in realistic contexts. Design modules around real problems, policy memos, op-ed critiques, experimental designs, so learners practice the move from abstraction to application. Exercises should be deliberately varied in format, timed drills to sharpen rapid assessment, take-home analyses for deeper reflection, peer debates to practice steel-manning and rebuttal, and replication tasks where students attempt to reproduce a study's analysis. Feedback is essential. Provide concise, actionable corrections focusing on where reasoning failed, missing premises, weak evidence, or unjustified causal leaps, rather than on stylistic preferences. Assessment should emphasize rubrics that capture clarity of definitions, structure of argument, evidence quality, sensitivity to alternative explanations, and calibration of confidence. Use scaffolded rubrics that convert these criteria into observable markers. Did the students state operational definitions? Did they map key premises and identify missing evidence? Did they propose a falsifiable test? Include self-assessment components so learners practice metacognition. Have them write brief updates explaining why their initial confidence changed after new evidence. Peer review improves calibration and exposure to diverse viewpoints. Train students to give constructive critiques by using checklists and mandatory positive corrective feedback formats. For institutional adoption, create a progression model. Foundational modules teach conceptual tools and common biases. Intermediate modules focus on methods, basic statistics, experimental design, causal reasoning. Chapter 17. Decision, Hygiene at Scale, Organizational Practices. Organizations that want good decisions must design the environment so cognitive biases and sloppy reasoning are minimized by default. Decision hygiene is a set of institutional practices, standardized evidence requirements, pre-mortem protocols, independent review gates, and simple decision templates that force explicit assumptions. Start by mandating written decision briefs for significant choices that include a clear statement of objectives, alternative options, expected outcomes with probability ranges, key uncertainties, and an explicit list of what evidence would count as disconfirming. Require that briefs be reviewed by at least one independent reader who is not materially invested in the outcome. Independence reduces motivated reasoning and increases the chance of catching weak premises. Implement pre-mortems before launch. The team imagines the decision failed spectacularly and enumerates plausible failure modes, then designs mitigations for the highest probability or highest impact modes. Use staged commitments, pilot, evaluate, scale, rather than all-or-nothing rollouts. For procurement and negotiation, use parallel bidding and external valuations to avoid anchoring and collusive framing. In governance, adopt time buffer rules for irreversible choices, mandatory reflection periods, and cooling-off windows that reduce urgency-driven mistakes. For routine operations, apply checklists and templates that externalize best practice, meeting agendas that require a decision objective and next steps, hiring processes that separate evaluators from managers to avoid selection bias, and post-implementation reviews that compare forecasts to outcomes. Data governance is critical. Ensure accessible, auditable data and define clear analytic standards so stakeholders interpret evidence consistently. Cultivate dissent structurally by rotating devil's advocate roles and by requiring at least one documented counterargument for major proposals. Training matters. Teach managers basic probability thinking, simple statistics, and common biases. Finally, measure decision quality, not only by outcomes but by process indicators, percentage of decisions with independent review, frequency of pre-mortems, and alignment between stated assumptions and later reality. Decision hygiene turns good judgment from an individual virtue into an organizational competence that reduces catastrophic errors and accelerates learning. Chapter 18. Creativity and Critical Thinking. Balancing divergence and rigor. Creativity and critical thinking are not enemies. They are complementary disciplines that, when balanced, produce original and robust solutions. Creativity requires divergence, generating many hypotheses, analogies, and possibilities, while critical thinking brings convergence, evaluating, testing, and selecting the best options. Structure workflows to alternate phases. Set aside divergence windows explicitly where evaluation is deferred, followed by focused convergence periods using strict criteria. Use techniques that maximize both brainstorming with forced variation, generate alternatives under constraints, analogical transfer, map distant domains for new heuristics, and rapid prototyping, convert a promising idea into a testable artifact quickly. During convergence, apply the tools of critical thinking, reconstruct the proposed solution's causal chain, identify hidden assumptions, and design minimal experiments to falsify key links. Encourage teams to use fast fail pilots, small-scale tests that provide quick evidence, so creative energy is quickly filtered through empirical reality. Avoid premature critique during ideation by using idea capture rituals, anonymous submissions, time-boxed free writing, and then apply structured filters later. Reward the interplay, recognize both the best novel idea and the best evidence-driven iteration. Train people in meta skills that support both modes, curiosity drills that enhance idea generation, and skepticism training that improves evaluation without stifling novelty. Finally, document failures as creative assets, maintain a repository of crude prototypes and negative results. These artifacts seed future recombinations and prevent reinvention of past mistakes. A culture that alternates permissive exploration with rigorous testing harnesses creativity into durable innovation rather than letting it remain attractive but ephemeral. Chapter 19. Cognitive Resilience, Managing Stress, Bias and Information. Overload. Sustained high-quality thinking requires cognitive resilience, practices that preserve attention, reduce bias under stress, and manage information influx. First, manage capacity. Schedule high cognition tasks in chronobiologically optimal windows, protect deep work time from interruptions, and use decision batching to minimize fatigue from repeated small choices. Second, reduce information overwhelm through deliberate filtering. Subscribe selectively, use summaries and pre-reads for meetings, and enforce discipline on data requests. Ask, what problem will this data answer? Before generating reports. Third, stress and emotion distort judgment. Incorporate low-cost physiological practices that stabilize cognition, brief breathing routines, movement breaks, and short naps where appropriate. Teach teams to recognize cognitive depletion signals, short tempers, shallow reasoning, and disproportionate reliance on heuristics, and to apply simple recovery protocols. Pause, defer large decisions, and run a mini pre-mortem after rest. Fourth, counteract bias in stressful contexts with checklists and default heuristics. Require simple evidence checklists before urgent actions, and use pre-set fallback options that preserve optionality. Fifth, build social resilience. Rotate critical roles to prevent fatigue, maintain backup decision authorities, and institutionalize buddy checks for high-stakes choices. Finally, cultivate media hygiene. Train people to verify sensational claims before sharing, to triangulate across reliable sources, and to prefer slower, structured deliberation over real-time, reactive commentary. Cognitive resilience is operational. It combines scheduling, physiological care, information, curation, and institutional safeguards so thinking quality persists even under pressure. Chapter 20, Lifelong Learning and Intellectual Humility, Sustaining Better Thinking. The best thinkers are perpetual learners who pair curiosity with humility, eager to update beliefs and systematic about improving judgment. Build a personal learning loop, regularly curate a reading list across diverse domains, practice deliberate reflection by summarizing key takeaways in short notes, and schedule monthly error reviews where you examine wrong predictions and why they occurred. Cultivate intellectual humility by tagging confidence on every important belief and tracking calibration over time. Did 70% confidence correspond to approximately 70% accuracy? Seek disconfirming evidence actively and create social norms that reward admitting mistakes publicly. For organizations, institutionalize learning through after-action reviews that focus on causes and remedies, not blame. Rotate roles to prevent intellectual stagnation and fund cross-disciplinary sabbaticals that expose employees to different problem frames. Mentorship accelerates growth. Both teaching and being taught sharpen reasoning. Use teaching as a test. Explaining a concept forces you to identify gaps and simplifies complexity. Embrace the beginner's mind in new domains while applying core mental models broadly. Finally, prioritize curiosity rituals, short daily reading, weekly synthesis writing, and quarterly experiments that apply new frameworks. Intellectual humility and lifelong learning are mutually reinforcing. Humility opens you to correction, and learning gives you the tools to improve. Over decades, steady practice converts modest daily investments into a reliably sharper mind that adapts to complexity rather than being overwhelmed by it. Conclusion: practice, feedback, and a lifetime of better decisions. Critical thinking is a craft, not a talent. The path to mastery runs through deliberate practice, honest feedback, and resilient systems that preserve clarity under pressure. Start small, make one decision, process cleaner, run one micro-experiment, and keep a short evidence log. Teach others what you learn, seek dissent, and update when warranted. Over time, the habits described in this book, probabilistic thinking, rigorous evidence standards, calibrated humility, and institutional decision hygiene, compound into consistently better choices and a life oriented toward truth rather than convenience. Commit to the practice, protect your cognitive resources, and let curiosity lead you to increasingly reliable judgments.